KarolineLeavitt, known for her sharp rhetoric and unapologetic stance on government accountability, found herself in an unusual position, 30,000 feet in the air, in the cabin of a commercial airliner. On what was supposed to be a routine flight, she acted with the same tenacity that characterizes her time behind the White House press podium. Faced with an unfolding situation mid-flight that she deemed urgent, she made a direct and immediate request to change the flight's course. Her actions stunned many on board, not because they were erratic or impulsive, but because they were so emblematic of her style, decisive, confident, and unyielding in the face of protocol. The moment she stood up to address the situation, passengers around her could sense the gravity in her tone. There was no grandstanding, no theatrics. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention. Instead, she articulated a rationale that she believed made the case for a mid-flight adjustment compelling and necessary. Drawing on her experience managing crises in the press room and shaping public discourse, she brought a calm intensity to the moment that made people listen, even if they didn't fully understand the urgency behind her request. Her decision to act, even in the confines of an aircraft, reflects how deeply she carries her responsibilities. For her, public service isn't confined to offices, podiums, or press briefings. It follows her everywhere. That mindset, while rare, is what makes her a lightning rod in American politics. She doesn't compartmentalize her duties. The weight of her role is something she carries with her in every environment, even one as unlikely as the passenger cabin of a plane. What motivated her to make the request wasn't personal convenience or discomfort. It was, from her perspective, a matter of broader concern. Something during the flight, a series of events or pieces of information she became privy to, led her to believe that a deviation in the current course was not just preferred, but necessary. And rather than wait passively for someone else to act, she took the initiative. This move revealed a lot about her leadership style. It's hands-on, immediate, and built on the belief that decisive action, even in unconventional situations, is preferable to waiting for red tape to unravel. Passengers whispered, curious about what prompted such a sudden intervention. Some looked surprised, others confused. But those who recognized her weren't entirely shocked by her behavior. Her reputation preceded her. She's known for questioning norms, especially when those norms appear to clash with the interests or safety of everyday citizens. To her, policy isn't theoretical. It has real-world consequences. That belief was clearly in play here. While many public figures are content to pass responsibility to others, she leaned into it, even in a moment where most would stay seated and silent. Her approach to leadership has always been about action over optics. She doesn't engage in performative politics. This was not about creating a viral moment or courting media attention. There were no cameras, no press pool, just a situation she believed warranted attention and her willingness to step into it. It takes a certain level of commitment and courage to advocate for something knowing that others might not immediately understand or support your reasoning. But she did it anyway. What unfolded in that cabin was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of how seriously she takes her role in public life. While many leaders choose safety in silence, she chose risk in action. That choice, while controversial to some, is part of a larger ethos she brings to governance. It's an ethos built on vigilance, directness, and a refusal to be a bystander, no matter the setting. The situation may have caught fellow passengers off guard, but for those who followed her career, it was a quintessential moment of character. It demonstrated how a sense of duty, when deeply internalized, doesn't switch off with the seatbelt sign. It travels with you, ready to surface whenever the moment demands. The refusal to accommodate the request mid-flight came as a surprise, not just because of its nature, but because of who was making it. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had shifted the moment the request was made. Passengers were no longer simply travelers. They were now witnesses to a scenario that teetered between protocol and power, urgency and routine. What made the refusal all the more striking was the confidence with which it was delivered. A firm denial issued not with malice, but with the calculated weight of procedure and precedent behind it. This response was not impulsive. It was measured and deliberate, grounded in a perspective that values structure, order, and adherence to guidelines. There was a quiet defiance to the denial, not loud or aggressive, but absolute. The underlying sentiment was clear. No matter who made the request, or how compelling the reasoning may have seemed, there was a line that would not be crossed. That line, defined by rules and reinforced by years of institutional tradition, was not open to negotiation, even in unusual or high-stakes moments. Observers, especially those familiar with the inner workings of power and public service, saw this not merely as an isolated decision, but as a symbolic moment. It served as a reminder of how deeply divided interpretations of authority and urgency can be. On one hand, there was the call to act, to adapt in real time based on perceived need. On the other, there was the belief that structure must prevail, that allowing even a small exception might unravel a tightly woven system meant to preserve stability above all else. The refusal sent ripples through the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another, exchanging puzzled looks, quietly debating what just occurred. Some admired the resolve of the response, interpreting it as a principled stance against pressure. Others questioned whether an opportunity had been missed, an opportunity to show flexibility or consider context over rigid compliance. The moment sparked a kind of silent, philosophical debate, one that rarely takes place so vividly in such a confined and transient space. What stood out most was how unwavering the denial was. There was no extended discussion, no probing for compromise. The decision was presented as final. It echoed the kind of institutional confidence that suggests policies, once set, must be followed without exception. The refusal wasn't personal. It wasn't aimed at undermining anyone. It was a manifestation of a worldview in which individual requests, no matter how urgent, must yield to collective protocols designed to ensure consistency and safety. What made the moment even more complex was the broader climate in which it occurred. Outside that plane, the country was steeped in debates about authority, about who gets to make decisions and under what circumstances rules should bend. Inside the cabin, that national conversation found a microcosm, a real-time test of how those in control of systems choose to wield that control, whether with flexibility or rigidity, empathy or distance. There was also an unspoken message in the refusal. It suggested that allowing one exception could invite others, that if this particular request was granted, future scenarios might demand the same consideration, weakening the framework that keeps operations running smoothly. It was a stance rooted in a preventative philosophy, one that values precedent as much as the action itself. For some, this position felt overly cautious, maybe even indifferent to the nuance of the situation. But for others, it was the embodiment of principle, a refusal to deviate from course, literally and figuratively, without overwhelming justification that surpassed any one person's judgment. It's a reminder that in some spaces, authority is exercised not with emotion or instinct, but with discipline, structure, and restraint. This wasn't about disrespect or dismissal. It was about differing values colliding in a moment that demanded clarity. One side prioritized swift action based on situational awareness. The other prioritized uniformity and procedure above spontaneous deviation. It became clear that this refusal wasn't an anomaly, but a reflection of a larger, deeply held belief system about how order should be maintained, especially in environments where the margin for error is slim. What was perhaps most thought-provoking was how such a brief exchange could encapsulate so many layered questions about responsibility, autonomy, and decision-making in high-stakes environments. The denial, while simple on the surface, represented a dense and deliberate response rooted in a worldview that resists unpredictability in favor of control. And for everyone on board, it was a moment that revealed just how much the framework we operate within shapes not only our choices, but the way those choices are perceived by others. The situation unfolding in the aircraft brought attention to more than just a momentary clash of judgment. It exposed the underlying tensions surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, particularly in high-stakes professions such as aviation. This wasn't the first time questions had been raised about how federal hiring practices intersect with public safety, but the timing and circumstances of this incident amplified the conversation in ways that couldn't be ignored. The request made in that cabin wasn't just about changing course. It became, unintentionally or not, a mirror reflecting broader societal debates about merit, representation, and the risks of bureaucratic ideology overtaking common sense. There has been a growing concern across various sectors that the prioritization of identity metrics over performance-based evaluations could lead to dangerous outcomes, especially in roles that demand the highest levels of skill, judgment, and precision. Aviation, with its zero-tolerance margin for error, has become one of the most potent symbols in this debate. When a mid-flight situation presented itself and a decision had to be made, the incident was no longer just about flight protocols. It became a metaphor for a deeper issue. What values guide those in control, and how were they placed in those positions to begin with? The argument isn't against diversity itself. The concern lies in whether the pursuit of diversity is being implemented thoughtfully or at the expense of excellence. Federal mandates and institutional shifts have introduced benchmarks and goals that, while well-intentioned, sometimes blur the lines between inclusion and compromise. Those who question these systems often cite examples where credentials, experience, and meritocratic standards appear to be secondary to checking the right boxes. This case added fuel to that fire. The person who made the in-flight request may not have intended it as a political statement, but the response to that request inevitably reignited a political debate. At the heart of the discussion is a simple but deeply charged question. Should the way we hire people in critical roles prioritize identity factors, or should it be strictly based on proven ability and qualifications? For many, especially those who value traditional metrics of expertise, the answer is obvious. But the issue isn't as black and white as it seems. Federal agencies have been under pressure to reflect the populations they serve. That means expanding access, reducing barriers, and ensuring that all communities have a fair shot. However, critics argue that when the pendulum swings too far, it creates a climate where some individuals are advanced or protected not for what they can do, but for what they represent. This flight became a flashpoint because it involved one of the most regulated and safety-sensitive environments imaginable. There's an expectation that every person involved in operating an aircraft, whether in the cockpit or on the ground, has been selected based on the highest professional standards. When that expectation is perceived to be in jeopardy, even if only symbolically, people pay attention, and in this instance, attention was certainly paid. For those who have long been skeptical of DEI frameworks and federal hiring, this was seen as confirmation that ideology may be creeping into areas where precision and experience should be non-negotiable. It wasn't just about the refusal. It was about the perceived justification for the refusal, the mindset behind it, and whether that mindset had been shaped more by policy than by professional necessity. That distinction matters deeply to those who see DEI not as a form of progress, but as a potential liability when applied indiscriminately. Others, of course, push back. They argue that diversity does not inherently weaken institutions, and that the assumption it does is rooted in outdated thinking. They point to data showing that inclusive teams can lead to better outcomes and that barriers to entry have historically excluded capable individuals for reasons unrelated to talent. But even among those sympathetic to these goals, there's a growing call for balance, an insistence that the drive for representation must always be matched by rigorous standards of competence. The moment on that flight didn't settle the debate. Instead, it acted like a spotlight, throwing a single event into sharp relief and letting the public draw their own conclusions. Was the refusal about rules and safety? Was it a reflection of a system that values policy compliance above real-world urgency? Or was it simply the outcome of institutional inertia, shaped by new priorities and internal shifts in how candidates are evaluated and promoted? No matter the interpretation, the incident reminded everyone that the people placed in roles of authority and responsibility are not just products of their training or experience. They are also, increasingly, products of a hiring culture that is evolving in real time. And as that culture changes, so too does the level of scrutiny it receives, especially when decisions are made in moments where the stakes couldn't be higher. The aftermath of the in-flight incident sparked a wave of reactions that stretched far beyond the cabin walls. What began as a tense exchange of authority mid-air quickly evolved into a flashpoint for public discourse, unearthing deep concerns around not only the professionalism and preparedness of those operating in critical industries, but also the cultural divide on how safety and leadership should be interpreted in modern America. Reactions ranged from quiet curiosity to vocal outrage, with individuals on both sides using the moment to reinforce broader arguments about trust, governance, and institutional integrity. Passengers who witnessed the exchange firsthand were the first to react, and their impressions spread quickly through social media posts, through news outlets, and eventually through national conversations. For some on the plane, the refusal to accommodate the course change was a demonstration of resolve and professionalism. They saw it as an affirmation that routine and safety protocols would not bend, regardless of who made the request. In their eyes, the refusal was not an act of defiance but one of discipline, proof that personal influence could not override the standards that keep everyone safe. But others viewed it differently. For them, the refusal highlighted a rigid mindset that failed to adapt to the context of the moment. They questioned whether the decision was truly grounded in concern for safety or whether it reflected a growing culture of performative control, where those in positions of responsibility resist change or challenge, not because it's right to do so, but because they can. These observers raised serious questions about whether such rigidity was a feature or a flaw in the system. More than just a singular moment, the situation amplified an already growing unease about competence and readiness across sectors that carry life and death responsibility. Public trust in institutions like aviation relies on a belief that the individuals in control are the most qualified, most focused, and most capable. Any perceived lapse, no matter how minor, can trigger a cascade of doubt. And in this case, the refusal, coupled with the visible frustration it caused, led many to revisit their own assumptions about who is in charge and whether they can be trusted to respond appropriately under pressure. The timing couldn't have been more relevant. In recent months, a string of near-miss incidents in transportation had already stirred conversations about whether the hiring processes within critical agencies were producing the best candidates. The episode on board only intensified that scrutiny. People began drawing connections, fair or not, between what they witnessed and the policies they believe may be compromising quality in the name of optics or compliance. Safety for most travelers is a silent contract. They board, they trust, and they expect that those at the helm are there because they earned it, through years of training, through rigorous evaluation, through merit. When that trust is shaken, even indirectly, the consequences ripple. Individuals who may have never questioned aviation protocols before began to ask hard questions. Who makes decisions at 30,000 feet? Are those decisions influenced by political culture? Are we still prioritizing expertise over ideology? The conversation spilled into public forums and media outlets, where analysts, commentators, and concerned citizens debated what the incident revealed about the current state of national hiring standards. Some defended the integrity of the system, arguing that one moment cannot be taken out of context or weaponized to discredit the whole. Others insisted that it was exactly moments like this, unscripted, urgent, real, that expose the gaps that can't be seen from behind a desk or through a resume. In a way, the story became less about the people involved and more about what the moment represented, a collision between perception and policy, between expectation and execution. It prompted everyday Americans to reconsider their comfort with the unseen systems they rely on daily. It made something as mundane as a flight feel uncertain, not because of turbulence or weather, but because of human decision-making in the cockpit and the assumptions behind those choices. There was no unanimous consensus in the court of public opinion. Some applauded the steady hand that upheld regulations. Others condemned what they saw as a missed opportunity for leadership and flexibility. But what united nearly everyone was a shared sense that something had shifted, that a quiet question about safety and judgment had suddenly grown louder, harder to ignore, and more personal than ever. The aircraft may have landed without incident, but the questions it raised continued to hover, unresolved and echoing in the public mind. In the end, what unfolded on that flight was about more than a single request or a single refusal. It was about the deeper questions that lie beneath the surface of our institutions and the values we assign to leadership, authority, and accountability. The incident served as a prism through which larger societal concerns were refracted. How we define professionalism, what we expect from those in power, and whether our systems are truly built to withstand the tension between procedure and urgency. Moments like these don't just disappear when the wheels touch down, they linger, prompting conversations at dinner tables, in boardrooms, in classrooms, and in the halls of government. They force us to examine whether we are too reliant on routine or whether we've grown too comfortable assuming that everything will function as it should, even when our systems are under strain. The clarity with which this particular event struck the public consciousness speaks to the way real-life scenarios test the principles we talk about in theory: fairness, merit, safety, representation, and adaptability. No matter where one stands on the issue, it's clear that this was more than a headline. It was a cultural checkpoint. It revealed how polarized perspectives can be when it comes to something as fundamental as who gets to make decisions and why. It reminded people that in a world increasingly driven by policy, politics, and perception, trust remains the most fragile but vital element in public service. Once shaken, it takes more than press statements and policy revisions to rebuild. What made the incident even more powerful was that it wasn't planned. It wasn't staged for cameras or orchestrated for effect. It was raw, unscripted, and deeply human. Two people operating within the framework of their roles, making choices based on their understanding of duty. And yet, that very realness is what gave it so much weight. It showed how the decisions made in the span of a few minutes can echo far beyond the moment, shaping narratives, reinforcing beliefs, and sparking lasting debate. As conversations about institutional reform, safety, and hiring standards continue, this moment stands as a stark example of why those discussions matter. Because it's not just about policy, it's about the people behind the policy, their training, their temperament, their judgment. It's about ensuring that the structures we depend on are being led by those who not only meet the standard, but understand the responsibility it carries. The plane eventually landed, the passengers disembarked, and life moved on. But what happened in that cabin stayed with people, not because of the altitude, but because of the clarity it brought. It was a reminder that leadership is tested not in planned speeches or scheduled meetings, but in the unanticipated moments when action, principle, and perception all collide. And when they do, the ripple effect reaches far beyond the